This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Marissa Kepley, Kansas Farm Service Agency Farm Loan Specialist, as she shares an update from the FSA. She pays special attention to the farm loan programs they offer. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, keeps the show moving as he discusses what pests growers could be finding in their wheat crop. He explains winter grain mites and army cutworms. Part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Phillip, Lancaster, and Brian Lubbers in today's show as they converse about what could be causing heifers calving issues. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from the Kansas Farm Service Agency. And today we're joined by Farm Loan Specialist Marissa Kepley. Marissa, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Marissa, beginning off with just a general update of what's happening at the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas.
Sure, absolutely. So right now we are about halfway through our fiscal year, so all of our loan activity is remaining steady, so that is great. Looking at budget and things like that, we did get a continuing resolution that was passed late last week, so that's going to provide a lot more stability to our programs and our agency as we move forward, because we will remain funded through the remainder of the fiscal year that runs through September 30th of 2025. Just kind of looking at some of our activity in general. With our direct loan program here in Kansas, we've received over 1,000 applications, and with that have obligated over $118 million for Kansas farmers here under the direct operating and farm ownership loan programs. Alongside that, we do have our partner program with the guaranteed loan program, and in Kansas, we're looking at so far 86 applications with obligations over $25 million being obligated between the operating and farm ownership program for the guaranteed side.
What are interest rates currently with FSA?
So our interest rates, they reset every month. So good for 30, 31 days. Here in March 1st, we had them reset. We're looking at direct farm ownership loans, which those can be used to purchase farm real estate. Those current rates are at 5.875. Under the farm ownership program, we've got some joint financing and participation loans that are at a current rate of 3.875. And then we've also got the down payment program, which is available to beginning farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers, or veteran farmers, where they put about 5% down. Another lender covers 50%, and then FSA finances 45% of the financing. That current rate for those loans is 1.875. We've got the direct operating loan program. So for that, it could be purchasing machinery, equipment, livestock, or annual operating expenses. That currently is at 5.5%. And then within our guaranteed loan program, we do not set those rates in particular. Those are set by the local financial institution that's providing the loan, but they are required to stay below a certain maximum threshold and be competitive with their non-guaranteed ag loans.
And Marissa, can you remind us a little bit more about direct loans with the Kansas Farm Service Agency?
Yes, absolutely. So our direct loans, those are the ones that are funded by the federal government and serviced directly by our employees in the local FSA offices. They aim to, help producers from the beginning farmers that are just starting out and have limited financial history. Maybe they can't quite qualify for traditional commercial credit yet, all the way to, experienced farmers that have maybe suffered some sort of financial setback or, natural or economic disaster. Within the direct program, like I mentioned earlier, those farm ownership loans, if somebody wants to look at purchasing a farm or enlarging a farm or construct buildings or some other structural improvements, we can loan up to $600,000 under that program with a maximum repayment of 40 years. We've got our farm operating loans, so those can be used for the normal day-to-day operational expenses. So if you have someone purchasing, seed, feed, fertilizer, that sort of thing, They can make machinery and equipment purchases or minor improvements like corrals to their operations, or even look at refinancing some non-real estate related debts. For that side of the thing, loans, we can go up to $400,000 with a 7-year repayment. If we're looking at our annual operating loans, those day-to-day expenses, those are generally repaid within 12 months or whenever the commodities are sold for the operation, whenever they have that income stream coming in.
How are guaranteed loans different than that?
Our guaranteed loans, those are loans that are available to operators, like I said earlier, that might not meet the traditional commercial lender standards, and those are loans that are made and serviced by commercial banks, credit unions, farm credit institutions, where the government comes in and offers a guarantee on those loans. So some incentive for those financial institutions to make the loan. With the guarantee program, we can look at guaranteeing a loan up to typically 90%, in some limited cases up to 95%. And what that does is that, entices the lender to make the loan, helps stretch out that credit, and provides a safety net to the financial institution involved should something happen with the loan and there would be a loss. Typically, what we're looking at there, loan limit-wise, it's a maximum that adjusts every fiscal year, and that's based off of the cost of business that it costs the farm to operate. Presently, for fiscal year 2025, on the guaranteed loan program, we can loan up to $2.2 million.
How do farmers and ranchers or anyone involved in agriculture finding interest in these loans go about applying for them?
So they can either go into their local office, one-on-one visit with our farm loan managers and farm loan office staff that are there, or they can access information via our website, Farmers.gov. It's got a lot of useful information, not just about FSA programs, but agency-wide throughout USDA. That site also provides a lot of good program reminders, deadlines for sign-up, and that sort of thing. On the loan aspect on Farmers.gov, it also provides a loan assistance tool, kind of explains loans, walks you through the process, even allows you to apply online if you want to and learn about each loan and the general eligibility that's required for those loans.
Are there some upcoming sign-up dates that you'd like to make listeners aware of?
Yeah, we've got just a couple of deadlines coming up here soon. So for our Price Support and Conservation Division, we've got the Dairy Margin Coverage, or DMC program. 2025 sign-up is currently running, but it does have an enrollment deadline of March 31st, so just a couple of weeks here away. Producers want to make sure they get into the office and get that taken care of. And then on the farm program side, we are actively enrolling for the 2025 program year for the ARC PLC sign-up, and that will run through April 15th.
Marissa, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
All right. Thank you so much, Shelby. Appreciate it.
That was Kansas Farm Service Agency Farm Loan Specialist Marissa Kepley. As always, if you're wanting to find out more information from the Kansas Farm Service Agency, you can do so by visiting one of their local service centers or by going online to Farmers.gov. I will link that in today's show notes on acttoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Natural Resources Conservation Service historian Shelby Calloway.
March is a very notable month in history for the Agriculture Department agency known as the Natural Resources Conservation Service.
In March 1935, President Roosevelt moved the agency from the Department of Interior to the USDA, where its name changed from Soil Erosion Service to Soil Conservation Service, part to kind of give it a more positive name, what you're trying to do here.
But just as important, according to NRCS historian Shelby Calloway,
Congress took up the question also in March of establishing it as sort of a permanent conservation service to combat soil erosion. Clock was ticking. Temporary funding that had provided for the soil erosion service was set to expire, and so we kind of needed to do something.
And the backdrop to all this change and movement in federal soil conservation efforts, the Dust Bowl era of the mid-1930s.
Major dust storms that had been mostly localized in the Midwest during the early 30s were by 1934 increasingly getting bigger and bigger, and you're getting soil particles all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. This is soil from Kansas. On March 6th and March 21st, 1935, there were dust clouds from the Midwest in the sky over Washington, D.C.
The timing of that second dust storm was fortuitous for the director of the Soil Erosion Service and champion of soil conservation, Hugh Hammond Bennett.
On March 20th, just as we've got dust clouds rolling in around that kind of time, there was a subcommittee in the House hearing on soil conservation, and Hugh Hammond Bennett is there testifying, and he sort of used the timely arrival of these dust storms on March 21st to kind of dramatically make the case that soil erosion is not a localized or regional issue. This is a national menace. Fighting it demands an organized national solution.
And after the House subcommittee hearings concluded on March 25th, 1935,
by April 23rd, there was a bill for creating a permanent soil conservation service on the president's desk, and President Roosevelt signed the Soil Conservation Act April 27th, 1935, creating the permanent soil conservation service in the USDA.
Callaway notes the irony of the timing of dramatic dust storms over the nation's capital, looming as Hugh Hammond Bennett advocated for a permanently funded soil conservation program before Congress.
That dramatic image of dust storms over Washington really ties the creation of this agency to the Dust Bowl, but it's important to remember that for Bennett, erosion wasn't usually so dramatic. It's this insidious kind of creeping evil, and he would use that word evil, best represented by this slow, relentless, waterborne sheet erosion that just very slowly impoverishes fields across the South and the Midwest. That dramatic combination of big gaping gullies capable of swallowing farmhouses and these big black blizzard dust storms in the Midwest, choking livestock and blatting out the sun, that kind of thing. That grabs the public attention, but the real menace is this less dramatic sheet erosion that's kind of impoverishing farms everywhere.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State's crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth as he lets us know what pest wheat growers might be finding in their fields. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about wheat pests with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. My pleasure.
Jeff, talking about a few different wheat pests today, and starting off with winter grain mites.
At the end of the year, the previous year at the fall, and the first of the next year is when we have problems with winter grain mites. As the name implies, they're most active just before winter and just after winter. They like cool weather. The temperatures that they're most active in are between 35 and 55 degrees. As it gets towards 75, they become less active. As it gets below 30 degrees, they become less active. But right now is the time, usually in March, early April, is the time of the year when the wintergrain mite eggs that were produced last November, December, they're hatching and the wintergrain mites are becoming active. I've been out the last couple of days and they are active. I think one of the reasons why we haven't gotten as much information about them as we usually do is because it's been relatively warm this time of year. As the name implies, their wintergrain mites are not active when it gets warm. They're active at night. They're active on cloudy days. When the temperatures get much above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, they go down into the soil and they become inactive, and then they'll be active at night. So we're not seeing a lot of activity yet. I think it's just primarily because we've had quite a bit of atypical warm weather. But I think we're going to see more and more. From looking at the forecast, I think we're going to see more and more wintergrain mite activity. There are a lot of wintergrain mites out there. Going into the winter, we had a healthy wintergrain mite population. They do best on well-watered, vigorous growing wheat. When the wheat's vigorous and well-growing, we don't notice them. They're little tiny mites. You can actually see them individually without magnification. I really think they're kind of a unique color. They have a dark-colored body with red legs and a red little spot on their back, and they can build up on the leaves of a wheat plant in the hundreds, and that's when they start doing the damage. Each individual mite will actually puncture one cell of the leaf and suck out the juice. So as the mites become more and more numerous on the leaves, they're sucking out more and more juice from different cells. Those plants will turn kind of a silvery color or a yellowish or brown even as the damage goes along, and the tips will kind of turn yellow and brown. But that's how we generally notice. The problem this year is a lot of the wheat that I've looked at in the last week is really being stressed because of moisture. We have some wheat that doesn't look too bad in low spots in fields, and the wheat in other parts of the field that are on a little higher ground. It really looks to me like we need some moisture. I'm not an agronomist. I've been doing this for a long time, but the wheat is not going to show any damage if it's still in dormancy or if it's stressed because of the lack of moisture. So I don't think the mite feeding damage is showing up yet. And they haven't gotten started that much, and I don't know if it's just because it's early. Generally, mid-March is when I generally start getting calls and start looking for winter grain mites. But this year it's been a little warmer than normal. Remember, I said they are winter grain mites because they like cool weather. If we do get moisture, I think we're going to see more and more winter grain mite damage. And generally, if it's a typical wheat field that's been in continuous wheat, the mites can be any place. If it's not, if it's a wheat field that's been planted as something else last year, the mites may move out from the grassy borders or the grassy areas because they feed on all different kinds of grasses. They just like wheat, first of all, in the spring because that's the first grass crop that we have, and we provided a nice, lush dinner plate for them so they can feed quite voraciously early on. The problem is if we don't have moisture, the feeding of the mites and the moisture stress really adds problems to the wheat, and it's going to really set back the growth quite a bit. So you're not going to see your plants growing as vigorously. Normally, when we talk about managing winter grain mites, you can go out at night with a flashlight. If your wheat looks like the growers always say it looks like it's going backwards to me. That generally means there's some kind of an insect or mite problem, or maybe a moisture problem in this case, or both. But if you go out at night, you can readily see the mites. They show up. Lots of times they'll be on the underneath side of the leaves, but a lot of times at night they'll be right on top. And you just go out there, just go kind of quietly, get down on your hands and knees with a flashlight, and you might be surprised at how many mites can be on the leaf of a small wheat plant feeding. So generally it's not all the way across the field. Generally there's just spots here and there. But the winter grain mites, it's the mite, the pest that we first are concerned with in wheat. Generally when it comes to managing this pest, we don't recommend treating for them because normally we get a nice rain. The rain will wash the mites off, and you won't have another problem with them. The insecticides work, but usually, and always in years past, we get a nice rain. It washes them all off, and the wheat recovers quickly, and you don't even notice it. So I rarely recommend treating for winter grain mites. But, again, if we don't get moisture and you got a heavy winter grain mite population feeding on the wheat that is stressed already because of moisture, you might consider an insecticide or a miticide application. But you can go to the wheat management guides, KSU wheat management guides, and it'll give you the numbers required or the threshold numbers before you would consider treating. But generally, we get rain, we're all good to go, and we worry about the next pest coming along in wheat.
So is that next pest Army cutworms?
Army cutworms are out there right now. Yes, ma'am. Last fall, I went to several different fields in south central Kansas and north central Kansas because of flocks of birds feeding in the fields. Some consultants over the years noticed that where there's a flock of birds feeding in late fall or early spring, late winter, generally there's a infestation of worms. The Army cutworms right now and the ones I've seen in the last week are really small. If you are noticing the wheat being fed upon, you'll notice little what we call window streaking, window painting on the leaves because the larvae are really small. They have just now, in the last week from the ones I've seen, they have just now started breaking dormancy themselves and starting to feed. It's from now, once that wheat starts breaking dormancy and these larvae start breaking dormancy, that they start feeding on the wheat, just like the winter grain mite. As that wheat is struggling for moisture, it's stressed because of moisture. Anytime you get an insect or a mite feeding upon it, they're competing with that plant for that moisture also. So that's going to damage the plant even more than just the feeding it would. Right now, the larvae are really small. They're only, the ones I saw last week were about a quarter of an inch. They're kind of a dusky color. They hide down in the soil. You really got to be looking for them. You really got to get down on your hands and knees and, scrape around the soil. Someplace where you suspect there are. They're not that difficult to find if you do that. But from now till probably the 1st of May, depending upon the temperatures, because temperature drives insect development 100%, the army cutworm is going to become active. And as they get bigger, they feed more voraciously as they get larger, and they do more damage on the crops, and it becomes more noticeable. So a lot of times from now till the first part or mid-April or first part of May, when I get calls about the wheat going backwards, it's army cutworms. Fall armyworms, they can be a problem, but they're not going to be a problem probably for another month or two. It's the army cutworm that's out there right now that as it grows, it becomes larger and takes in more food, and that's more detrimental to the crop. Especially if we're not having any moisture, if we don't get some adequate moisture between now and mid-April, with all the winter grain mites I've seen and all the army cutworms I've seen, we are going to have some real problems just with those pests. Then the question is going to be, should I treat or not? More so than normal, because if we don't get moisture between now and, 1st of May, the wheat's going to be struggling as it is anyway. So the next problem we're going to have, winter grain mites, army cutworms, and then the chinch bugs are going to move into the wheat. Chinch bugs will feed a little bit on the wheat. They generally don't hurt the wheat. They just build up their populations in May and June. But I have seen them actually cause problems in wheat, especially under drought stress. If you're going out and looking in your field, it looks like it's going backwards. You're losing vegetable matter. Your plants are disappearing. Look in the soil. That's probably an army cutworm. Or if there's birds out in your field feeding, that's probably an army cutworm for the next month. But that's what we have to look forward to. All this insect mite activity, just remember, it is magnified anytime we have plants under stress for whatever reason. And from what I've seen in the last week and from the forecast I've noticed for the next 2 weeks, it looks like that's going to be part of a farmer's life for the next early spring.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Sure, my pleasure, anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. I will link the resource that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and to end our show, we're joined by the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Phillip Lancaster, and Brian Lubbers.
Our next listener question is on feeding heifers, and I appreciate the amount of detail that they put into this question because, and Phillip, I'm going to start with you. They said, I've got late gestation heifers. I'm feeding them 4 pounds of a 14% protein feed. Free choice hay, which has 10% protein and 52% TDN, and want to keep them growing because we know they're growing as they're coming up on calving, and is concerned that I'm feeding them too much because we've had several Dystocia cases, some of which were successful and some of which weren't. The calves are really big. So I'm going to start with you. Are we feeding them too much?
So I would say no, because for first calf heifers, the 10% protein hay and 52% TDN is not going to be enough to keep them growing like they need to. They needed some supplement with that level of quality of hay. So I don't think that the feeding program is potentially the primary issue with some of his heifers having heavier calves than expected. Dystocia, generally when we think of a feeding program causing problems, yeah, it can increase birth weight, but usually a bigger problem is getting the heifers themselves over-conditioned and getting too much fat deposited in the pelvic canal, and that can cause problems.
So Brian, what else would you think about looking at?
So just from the listener question, they told us it's actually a pretty small heifer group. There's only 15 heifers here, but I would start to think about the bulls. Is it a bull? They said it's a low or 2 low birth weight bulls. What's low birth weight mean? And, is it matched to the size of the heifers? I don't know, if they have history with these bulls and they've done fine on heifers in the past. Maybe we could take that off the table as a possible cause. The other thing I wonder too, and maybe you guys can chime in, I vaguely remember seeing some research about cold weather and calving, like it has some potential to delay. And so, we've been in, I don't know how old this question is, but we've gone through a relatively long cold snap here recently. And if it could just be that and maybe a combination of all of those things and just, I hate to say just a little bit of bad luck and timing, but I think that legitimately could be part of the issue.
Well, most of our, and I agree, that could be a part of it. A couple of things to think about. Dystocia in heifers most of the time is related to fetal dam size mismatch. Dystocia in cows is often related to malpositioning. And he talked about the calves being big. The other thing that can come into play, we talked about, are they too fat? And it seems like they're feeding them a good ration. But I have seen at times, and we've worked with herds, where if the heifers are a little bit thin coming into calving, you can have uterine inertia, or as they start calving, they just don't have enough energy to expel that calf and come out. So that's another thing to be on the list of, we're thinking about nutrition. Seems like they've got a reasonable supplementation there, but I would worry more about having my heifers too thin, both because it takes them longer to breed back and you could have uterine inertia, than I would have them too fat.
And I'll follow up on Brian's comment that blood flow to the uterus is a pretty big factor in birth weight of the calf. So if you look at data, calves born in the summertime are generally quite a bit lighter birth weights than calves born in the wintertime because of the blood flow in the summertime being moved to the extremities of the dam to try to dissipate heat. So there's less nutrients concentrated around the uterus and going to the placenta and the calf. So a really cold spell where that dam is trying to keep blood to the vital organs in the internal part of the body could increase the birth weight. And so that's one of the thoughts maybe why he's seeing it in his later calving heifers, because they had a longer period of time going through this cold spell and allowed that calf to get a little bit bigger. Just some ideas. There's lots of factors that affect the birth weight of the calf: genetics, nutrition, environmental conditions, and so it's not just one thing or the other. Generally, it's a combination of things that ends up causing a potential mismatch of birth weight and pelvic size.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.